Hello and welcome to Nerdist Book Club, live on Nerdist and Geek and Sundry's YouTube, as well as Geek and Sundry's Twitch channel. I'm Rachel Heine, and joining me as always are two of my favorite people ever, Hector Navarro and Maude Garrett. Yay! Hi guys.
Hi, meow meow. I just realized I don't have the live chat on, so I'm trying to get that up real quick.
All good.
I got that YouTube chat popped out, ready to interact with the YouTube chat.
Thanks, y'all. Speaking of the chat, welcome to everyone at home. Thank you for joining us. This is our book club. It's a book club. It's online. You participate, send us questions, thoughts, casting ideas, disagree with us. We've gotten some people who, what was that one comment, Hector, where you kept calling him out one time? We'll still like you, even if you are shitty, but try not to. We'll be nice to you. We discuss different books each month-ish, and right now we are starting a new book that is also an HBO series, Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff. Whether you watch the show on Sunday or read the book, we're going to be talking about both as we go. There's no right way to enjoy. I know. I personally read and then watched, but I'm not going to shame anyone for watching and then reading.
I will. Don't do it.
That's fine. And likewise, I won't shame any of the chat participants for reading ahead. Very important detail, because they're not actually going to spoil us.
I stopped at the line and then I watched the episode and I had a real good time. A good time was had.
Thank you, Maude. Yeah. I appreciate it.
I
Cheers.
Promise it will up again. Cheers, probably wine. So yes, we have started this new book. We read the first two sections. Let us know in the chat, did you watch the show? Did you read first, watch? Did you watch then read? Have you read this before? Please let us know. And Maude, will you do us the honor of reading the description of Lovecraft Country for us?
Love, I thought you'd never ask. Chicago, 1954. When his father Montrose goes missing, 22-year-old Army veteran Atticus Turner embarks on a road trip to New England to find him, accompanied by his uncle George, publisher of the Safe Negro Travel Guide, and his childhood friend Letitia. On their journey to the manor of Mr. Braithwaite, heir to the estate that owned one of Atticus's ancestors, they encounter both mundane terrors of white America. That ain't mundane, by the way. And malevolent spirits that seem straight out of the weird tales that George devours. At the manor, Atticus discovers his
father.
Yep. At the manor, Atticus discovers his father in chains, held prisoner by a secret cabal named the Order of the Ancient Dawn, led by Samuel Braithwaite and his son Caleb, which is gathered to orchestrate a ritual that shockingly centers on Atticus, and his one hope of salvation may be the seed of his and the whole Turner clan's destruction. A chimerical blend of magic, power, hope, and freedom that stretches across time, touching diverse members of two Black families, Lovecraft Country is a devastating, kaleidoscopic portrait of racism and terrifying specter that continues to haunt us today.
That was amazing.
That was
fantastic.
A really interesting blend
of Southern and
yes.
Eastern, Southern,
yes.
East. Yeah, I heard it go back and forth, but I wanted it to be noir, but then I also got like Southern vibe.
I think it worked. It was beautiful. I appreciate it.
I'm looking forward to when we cover a book set in Australia and then I'm asked to read the back of that book. Yes. So that's going to be great. That's going to be great.
I can't wait. That'll be great. So we have a lot to get through today because I kind of geeked out and did a little bit of extra research to contextualize our reading. And we're just getting started with the book, so there's a lot to kind of dig into it. But generally, what do both of you think of the book so far to this point?
Honestly, I think when you were like, hey, is there anything specific that you want to touch on? I was like, immediately within the first like 5 pages, they mentioned Hector's favorite book series and your favorite book. And I was just like, this is kind of like celebrating literature. And it's a book within a book, which I kind of love. Like the fact that they are talking about actual prose and actual stories, but done in a very different time era, and obviously in a time that I have not been privy to and don't know much about. So I was really, really keen to learn about this one. And I will say that the notion of Jim Crow America isn't super common knowledge outside of America. My first question was, who's Jim Crow? And then the response is kind of like, what's Jim Crow? And I was like, oh. So that was really interesting as well. I do think that the show definitely enhanced the story for me.
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
I think it was really fascinating to I gotta work on my pronunciation for a bunch of stuff, but I think it was really fascinating I watched the show first, read the book goes beyond what the first episode is, and we're definitely going to be ahead of the episodes. It's going to be, I think, 10 episodes, so it'll be on HBO over the next 10 weeks. And I think it's so interesting to look at the differences and the changes that they made and why. And I think some were for basic like cinematic reasons. In the beginning of the book, Atticus is driving by himself and then has his inner monologue and then flips off the South of the United States that he's leaving because of the Jim Crow South. And in the show, he's on a bus so that he can have a conversation with a fellow bus passenger, and I'm like, all that makes sense to me. All that makes sense. And I think that even moving some stuff around and having it, just moving some of the sort of order of operations around a little bit, I thought was really, really well done. And including some of the fantastic lines that, like Maude was saying, are describing Atticus's love of fiction, and specifically science fiction and horror. There was some stuff that I think either was just his own inner monologue or him reflecting on a story, and then they pivoted it to, in the show, him having a conversation with his Uncle George. That kind of thing I felt like was so, so vital. So how am I enjoying the book so far? I'm really, really, really enjoying it. I think that it is as tense as people said it was going to be, and the tension is just as much there with the crazy Lovecraftian stuff as it is with the you're going to get pulled over by a white cop. Like, he's going to grab the guide. They're going to go to a restaurant and see that this was burned over. Like that stuff is just as terrifying as seeing monsters in the woods or getting attacked by monsters or whatever. So, and I also think that the show has a lot of similarities to me, or it's making me feel similar to when HBO came out earlier this year or last year. Watchmen. When Watchmen on HBO came out, was that this year or last year? That was this year, right?
Yeah.
It was like earlier this year.
I'm sure someone could fact check that.
Maybe last year. Thank you. Last year, Lee. Thank you. I don't remember.
October 20, 2019. You're welcome.
2019. Thank you very much, Maude. And Watchmen was a show that was, I think, immersed in how much it loved like superhero style fiction, the same way that the original comic book kind of does, while also being like, but here's something we don't get to talk about that often in this world: racism. We're going to talk about, the lead point of view is going to be Black characters and a Black character. And all of that stuff I feel like is present in Lovecraft Country. So as a brown nerd who is in fact a fan of the John Carter of Mars world and does acknowledge that, like, yeah, dude was an ex-Confederate soldier. You don't just get to put the X on that.
Yes, that was really powerful.
And then Atticus's response where he's like, we love stories the way we love people. Like, I was like, this is beautiful. And as a brown nerd, a lot of that stuff I completely related to and thought it was fantastic in the book and the show, both.
I will confess, hearing like in my Twitter feed, Black creators' reactions to those moments where they were like, I was sweating, I had heart palpitations, and I'm here going, of course, like, I'm not relating to that moment. And it's so interesting for me to realize that when that was happening, I was like, oh my God, they suck. Like, come on, stop being such dicks, police. And it was an eye roll thing.
Yes, I mean, especially if you have experienced that, which unfortunately most Black and brown people have in some way or another. Yeah. That is a very traumatic thing for you. And I think, it's it's super interesting because, well, we'll get into it with the author and the adaptation and everything. I want to highlight a couple of things. Avery Adventurous says, hey everyone, had a last minute change of plans, was able to join today after all. Hooray! Smarcy says, the book choices have been incredible so far in this iteration of the show. Thank you so much. Nathan S. said, read first, then watch, but I'm usually watch first. Miss Necromancer, the nerd culture trope with loving sci-fi and fantasy is very white-centric, so I love that we are seeing Black characters loving the stuff that is always seen as white pop culture. I totally agree, and I think that there has been definitely some upward movement for women in sci-fi, but largely white women. Like in Star Wars, it's always like a white brunette woman, and I don't need that many of me. I don't need it. We could have other types of people in there, but I think that we are, thank goodness. It's so many things, but you know, George as a producer on this and wanting to not only play with horror the way that he, you know, has, but the intersection of horror and race, I think is fascinating.
Yeah, there's a great, Nerdist just posted a link, a roundup of all the book references from the show's first episode, which I think is fantastic. I would love to piggyback off of what Miss Necromancer said and recommend one very specific thing, because I have also been, this whole time in quarantine, still trying to finish out watching. Yes, Reading Dodo Kiwi is talking about the thing I'm about to mention. I'm watching Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager right now, and I'm trying to finish them out because I've never seen them, and I've been going through them for months and a few years now.
Those are the ones that I would like the most.
I just recently got to, I'm going to recommend one episode of one of those shows. I just got to season 6, episode 13 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Season 6, episode 13. Everybody watching right now, jot it down, pull up another tab, find this episode, and then make it a point at some point to watch it in the future. It's very disconnected from the rest of Star Trek, that series. You're not going to be lost. It's an episode called Far Beyond the Stars. And this thing,
heard about this one.
It's beautiful and devastating. And the premise is that it is somehow some sort of time travel experiment where the main character of the show, Deep Space Nine, who happened to be a black male, Benjamin Sisko, is somehow wakes up and he's in the 50s. He's in the mid 50s, and he wakes up and he's a science fiction writer. And the entire episode, he goes to his job where he gets freelance work to write for science fiction. He, of course, has to pretend as though he's a white sci-fi writer to submit some stories and for those stories to see publication. The rest of the Star Trek cast are various people that either work in the office, they're his boss, they're, you know, the secretary of the office, whatever it is. And the entire episode is just talking about how there have always been people of color specifically, and also women, and also LGBTQ characters and people involved in science fiction and fantasy. And yet, and especially in that era of the 50s, which again, you can watch something like The Shape of Water, which Guillermo del Toro tries to play with. It was supposed to be make America great again, go back to those good days of the 50s. Who was it good for? One specific demographic, not so great for everybody else. Mm-hmm. And that even has a great horror, sci-fi love of movies and film that's in there.
And fish.
And fish, love of fish, because they have this thing. But Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Far Beyond the Stars, if you can in the next week, watch it, even if you've never seen any Star Trek thing, because it's heartbreaking. And it feels as though it's a real message that's being delivered by the writers to say, look, even within the world of Star Trek, which is supposed to be very diverse, we know we still have a long ways to go. Yeah. And so I just found it to be wonderful. And watching Lovecraft and reading Lovecraft, and Atticus specifically, made me think about that episode so much. So highly recommend. And yeah.
I think the biggest thing that I wanted to learn about was this man who's an author. Does he know what it's like? Has he got firsthand or secondhand experience? So let's talk about the author, because I was surprised with this.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going to talk about the author and a little bit of context about Jim Crow for anyone who doesn't know as much about it, and Lovecraft, because Lovecraft is a very interesting, very racist dude, and that ties in so much to this book because it is almost an answer to the art versus the artist conversation, and can you make something new out of that, even when you know that it's deeply flawed. And Atticus obviously dives into that in the book. So we'll address the elephant in the room. Lovecraft Country was written by a white dude,
Yeah.
named Matt Ruff. He's published a handful of fine novels, yep, but has shared that he actually came up with the idea for Lovecraft Country as a TV pitch. He did do an interview where he said that he was in college. He was born in 65, so probably in the 80s. He was in college and would just go off into the woods and kind of explore, and kind of backwoods dudes on their pickup trucks would drive by, and he was like, "You should try it," to his friend who was Black. And he was like, "If I do that, I'm not going to make it to graduation." And they had a really in-depth conversation about it and about his experiences. And down the line, it turned into an idea that he pitched in 2007 that studios did not go for, but then he wrote it into a book, and then it became a TV show.
Wow.
But he 2007, and the idea for this, so he basically pitched it as like a Monster of the Week show, kind of like the X-Files, but with a Black family in the 1950s. Quote from him: "The idea was to combine these weekly paranormal terrors with the more mundane horrors of life in the US at a time when segregation was still legal. Which is the bigger threat, the monster under the bed or the white policeman pulling you over on a road somewhere?"
Wow, I love that.
That's sort of the crux of the book. So we know that a show has just premiered. I loved it. Jordan Peele and showrunner Misha Green, who also worked on the very stellar Underground, which also stars Journey Smollett,
Smollett Bow?
Oh no, she got divorced. She is just Journey Smollett.
Yep. Sister of Jess. But Jordan Peele and showrunner Misha Green reached out to Matt Ruff about an adaptation before Get Out had even been released.
Wow.
And because it came out in 2016. And Matt Ruff recalls in a bunch of interviews saying, like, Jordan Peele doing horror, and it's like, now it's, he's the horror, but back, way back in 2016, it was, very different story. Many things.
Now stay woke.
And so they reached out about an adaptation before this. And Misha Green is also a huge horror buff. She also wrote or co-wrote every episode of the 10-episode season, and she's the showrunner, and she also developed it. So she's very into it. And I think she's just amazing. But this was what she said about the book, which I thought was really interesting. "I have read H.P. Lovecraft, and I understand why he has influenced so much of horror writing, but because of his history, I wasn't a huge fan." Fair. "When I read Matt Ruff's novel, I said, oh, it's legit, thank God. But here's my thing. For a white writer not to be able to step into the shoes of people of color confuses me. That should be the default. Many people of color have to step into the shoes of white people. Women have to step into the shoes of men. It's sad that we say, thank you for doing some research and for actually seeing people as people."
But I mean, this is this thing as well, where it's like, if the white man is always 9 times out of 10 going to be more successful, if they are then using that story to make it exist and then hand it over to the people that can do it justice, I mean, that's...
And they're making very interesting changes. I almost adjusted my glasses that I'm not wearing. Yeah, I do that all the time.
But that's like another thing that I thought, where it's like, is he equipped to be able to share this?
I think that's a super valid question that I don't feel equipped to answer. But I
have a thought on that I would love to talk about, and I'm so glad we're talking about it too, because I feel like I learned about the show and book in like the past few weeks. I wasn't aware, and then I'm hearing the show's coming out, and then you guys pitched a book, and I was like, let's do it. But then learning about the author, and just now with Rachel talking, learned more about him than I had known, and I think it's very interesting. But I have my roommate was present at a virtual sort of a conference, not a conference, but like a virtual public speaking of Ava DuVernay, the director Ava DuVernay. She did this this thing for like through the internet for a production company, and my roommate works for that production company. So Ava was there, and it was like a Q&A, and it was amazing. And so that one of the questions that was brought up, which I think is what we're talking about, is very valid. Going forward, can people who may not be one demographic, are they equipped, like Maude said, to tell stories and the perspective of people in another demographic? And Ava said something, I'm not trying to quote her exactly, I'm trying to paraphrase because I don't want to misrepresent her, but she says something to the effect of, I understand what you're asking. Can white people direct movies about black people, so on and so forth? And she said, my favorite movie of all time is The Color Purple, directed by Steven Spielberg. And she was like, I have no problem with white storytellers telling black stories and vice versa. She just said something to the effect of, I think the thing I take issue with is when the perspective is something I don't agree with. And then she listed as an example the movie Green Book. So that's a great controversial, right? That's white storytellers for the most part, producers, directors, writers that told that story. The hero. Making white people the hero about unlearning racism and kind of diminishing what that real black person and that black person's family. It's a really troubled production. Like it was very frustrating, the history of that. And also kind of diminishing the idea of the Green Book itself, or that safe travel guide that's present in this story as well. The movie Green Book is not about that. The movie Green Book is about an Italian guy, an Italian-American white guy, unlearning racism, when, again, people involved in that real story were like, that's not even how it is. And so Ava was talking about the perspective, the point of view. If the point of view is something that she can agree with, she was saying, and I echo these sentiments, then it's completely fine. And it is sometimes encouraged. And it is about people stepping into the perspective and wearing the shoes of another type of person. And that's great.
Yeah, I that's really helpful. And I bow down to Ava for all things. And I also, in researching Matt Ruff, his wife is a researcher. And so every time he mentioned something, she'd just pull out a bunch of books and be like, you need to read this. So like he did a lot of work here. I think, you know, there might be people in the chat or not part of this book club who don't agree. And I would love to hear those things because I don't know. But I think that Jordan Peele and Misha Green saw something really great in this and are adapting something even almost better because it has so many people of color involved and Black people involved in the production and the cast and everything. So, and some of the changes that we can talk about. So that's a little bit about the author. I'm just going to give a couple points. Yes.
I actually wanted to extend that with what Misha had said, which was the fact that she said, I have read H.P. Lovecraft and I understand why he's influenced so much of horror, but because of his history, I wasn't a huge fan. The question I want to ask Social and you guys just touch upon really quickly, can you, what is your stance on separating the creator from the content? So, you know, if the creator has been problematic, can you still appreciate or support or watch or even acknowledge the things that they've made? And we've seen this time and time again in Hollywood, in this space. Yeah,
absolutely.
Oh, yeah, totally. I would say my personal is depending on what the thing is, and that, or the controversy or history, and if they are currently living and you are receiving money from me consuming their work. So, for example, I can't think of anyone, but like if someone it's like an author who is deceased and they wrote a long time ago. I mean, I'm not a huge Lovecraft fan. It's never been a thing that I love Lovecraftian style, but I just never got into him. But that's
great
an
example, Maude. Great example, Maude.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great example. But I will never pay money to see a Mel Gibson movie ever.
Woody Allen.
Sure.
Woody Allen. Polanski. It's not going to happen. That's my
I won't go to Chick-fil-A.
I won't go to Chick-fil-A. I've never been.
Yeah.
There's so many other things to eat. It's like I'm not hungry.
But I would love to also respond to a really valid comment in the YouTube chat. Wu Kong says, this is a fitting question when we were talking about, you know, can white storytellers working with non-white characters and vice versa and everything. Wukong says it's a fitting question given this panel doesn't have a black person on it to offer input. Absolutely valid. And I would say I can only talk from my perspective, like I was mentioning earlier, being a brown dude who likes sci-fi and fantasy and all this other stuff. I would also say I would love to have one of our many, many wonderful Black friends who are either reading the book or have read it or watching the show, because it's coming out right now and everybody's talking about it. I would love to have somebody on our show as well to discuss. So that's something that I can say to Wukong. I know we're all aware of it. And I'll even promise it right now, we will have somebody on the show that's maybe not one of our regular 3 hosts, but to come on and absolutely, we've had guests on the show before, and that is a perfect excuse to talk to a friend of ours who is watching and taking in the show, and then they can offer their perspective. So,
and I also comment. Like a big thing that I've done is obviously diversify my feeds, and already like because of that, hearing, because it was huge, like everyone watched the show and everyone weighed in on it. And sort of reading other people's perspectives on that, just seeing and hearing how it differed from mine, like that is a really big growth thing for me to be able to learn about another perspective. And also this is super community based as well. So if people are watching along and in the comments, like we obviously want to share your voice as well.
Yes, absolutely. And that's sort of, I think, where it comes in that, we're trying to put ourselves in this position as well and understand, but we also want to hear from everyone how you feel and have other people share their insights as well. I have a couple of Nerdist articles to shout out later as we go through our research, because we've got some really great stuff up on the website that I'm really proud of. I know the whole editorial team is proud of. So let's dive in. Let's give a little context for
real quick as well. The perspective, even though, yes, I'm white. Yes, I am blonde. Yes, I look like the wholesome American girl. I have the perspective of not growing up in America. And can I just say the learning that I'm doing, but also kind of explaining to Americans that it's a very country-centric issue. So in Australia, we trust our police and we do not have this systemic racism that has been lasting, decades, and that is taught and that is acceptable in a workforce. Right. So for me to kind of learn about the issues that are happening here, but also to remind Americans that that doesn't necessarily exist on a global scale. It really is intrinsic. It is the foundation of this country alone, which I think is a perspective that definitely can change the scope of things, but America is.
Yes, it is. And I also think it's
the founding of, and Jim Crow laws also speak to how all of that is systemic racism, like how we get to where we are now. It's all connected back to, slavery, and then Jim Crow laws were this collection of laws that legalized segregation, named for a Black minstrel character. The laws existed for about 100 years, and they began almost immediately after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States. These laws were meant to marginalize African Americans, Black people, by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, a million other opportunities. Anyone who defied these laws faced arrest, fines, jail sentences, violence, and death. And at the time, sort of post-Civil War era, all of these former Confederate soldiers were working as police and judges. So there was there's no way to get it started then. And the original police started as slave catchers. I mean, it's built into the DNA, not just of our country, but of our judicial system. And the laws also worked alongside labor camps for the incarcerated, where Black prisoners were treated as if they were slaves, the prison industrial complex. Like, it's all connected to how America was founded and continued. It's not a recent thing. It's not something you can separate. That's why people talk about defunding the police, which doesn't necessarily mean what you think it does. Just Google it. I'm not going to explain it. But You know, we can find money for riot gear, but not for schools. We can, you know, we call 911 for someone having a mental health issue and not a social worker, or all these kinds of things, because it is baked in there. And that doesn't mean that every police officer is bad, but the actual system itself is bad. It's not right. It's not right. And anyway, I could go on, but you know, these laws continued. What?
Maude, you're muted.
Oh, I apparently, by mentioning another perspective, turned it into a competition and a way to slag my country and all of its flaws. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying that there are unique differences between countries. And I feel like as soon as someone says, wow, America's really got problems, it's like, yeah, but your country sucks too. Sure, that's a way to grow. That's a way for everything to get better. Thanks, guys.
Appreciate y'all in the chats. Continuing on.
Yes.
You know, as we're going from post-Civil War to the late 1800s, as soon as cities had more lax rules around Jim Crow, more Black populations moved to the city, which just resulted in an even larger backlash into the intense segregation that you saw through the 1960s and beyond. And still there are sundown towns, which we'll get into still today in this country. But
still today.
Yep. There's a link somewhere floating around that you can look up where they are in America. There's still sundown towns. They segregated parks, theaters, restaurants, buses, building entrances, elevators, cemeteries, hospitals. And then in 1919, which Watchmen touched on some of this, in 1919, at least 25 lynchings or mass lynchings and race riots took place over several months. This period was called Red Summer, where just the KKK and mobs of white people just murdered communities of Black people. And one of the unfortunate, most famous ones, because of what, like the amount of people, mostly white people, but the amount of people who did not know about the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1919 and learned about it from Watchmen is such a spotlight on the way that we educate people and kids in this country, that is not known, and that much of what's in our history books is propaganda.
Columbus Day used to be cool. Columbus Day used to be something that you would teach kids in the United States, like, to celebrate, because Christopher Columbus discovered America. And that, you know, that goes back to when we're talking about Watchmen, that goes back to that question that Maude was asking about, can you separate the art from the artist? Like, Watchmen is a comic book that I have a lot of respect and admiration for, and a lot of love for moments in that comic book. But even within that comic book, even with that comic book writer, Alan Moore, who is a mostly revered, people in the comic book world love the guy. And they're like, oh, this guy's the greatest writer of all time. Even within his work, I'm like, the way he treats people of color isn't stellar. The way he treats female characters isn't stellar. So then the HBO Watchmen show comes out, and it opens with Tulsa. And then it has a female character at its center. And even one of the characters in the comic book, Lori, grown up more, I'm like, this version of the character completely redeems any sort of issues I had with, you know, so I think that.
Is that what Ava DuVernay was talking about, though, where it's like you can have someone write the story, but then get someone who kind of like knows the perspective to tell it.
Damon Lindelof assembled like a writer's room. And there were specifically people who knew and loved the comic book and those who didn't know it at all. And he gave them copies. And he was very much about getting the perspective of his Black writers, his women writers, because that stuff's important. And they would bring stuff to the show that otherwise may not have been included. So to go back to that question, and I agree with Rachel's answer as well, like, it depends on what it is, and it depends on the content in terms of separating an artist from the art. And if there is a way to especially in today's world with everything being a remake, a sequel, taking back comic book stuff from the 60s and just making a new movie of it today in 2020. If there's a way to inject more perspectives or like more awareness in maybe an original content, then I also think that can lead to some great stuff. So I don't necessarily want to shut off. Like if I had the stance of, listen, Alan Moore didn't like the way he had virtually no people of color or treated people of color or women in the comic book Watchmen, therefore I'm going to swear off the entire Watchmen franchise, I would miss out on the new show and what it was saying and doing. So I have mixed feelings about Edgar Rice Burroughs. I have mixed feelings when people are huge fans of, I mean, we've been talking about it for the past couple of months with Harry Potter, with things coming to light about the author's point of view, and it's like such a bummer. So I have room in my heart for other people to work on stuff that some may deem problematic. It's like, oh, wait, don't cut it off yet, because what can other people add? Maybe it can be cool.
Or something like Harry Potter or Buffy, Joss Whedon projects and things like that, where the art is elevated beyond what the intent of the artist was and has meant something to you, and they can't take that away from you just because they're a transphobe or abusive or whatever.
Right. Absolutely. Pick your poison. Pick your poison. There's so many poisons.
So kind of jumping ahead, but that's sort of the background of Jim Crow. But Lovecraft Country takes place in 1954, around a little, 10-ish years before the March on Selma, John Lewis, and the Civil Rights Act. And although the novel uses Lovecraftian horrors to weave its tale, much of the setting is based on real history. When we meet Atticus Turner on his way from Jacksonville to Chicago, he checks the travel guide to find a mechanic for a blown tire. The novel's guide is based on the Negro Motorist Green Book, an annual guidebook published from, and I feel so uncomfortable even saying that. It's very
as you should.
But I was like, I don't know. Published from 1936 to 1966 by New York City mailman Victor Hugo Green for Black travelers. You can read more about the real history of Lovecraft Country's travel guide on Nerdist.com, written by, I believe, Ty Gooden, who is amazing.
Until 1966, that's crazy.
Yep. I mean, that's when the civil rights started, but still lots of issues, as we all know from real life. I just want to highlight a really incredible piece on Nerdist.com by Robert Daniels called Lovecraft Country and the Horror of Sundown Towns. Just a really semi-quick quote, but highly recommend everyone reading this article because it's beautifully written and well-researched. It's about the episode. But it ties, I think, very well into the book. So the episode creatively merges the specter of white racist cops with the bloodthirsty monsters crawling through the woods to tap into another danger that Black people faced: the perilousness of nighttime. Burning crosses are rarely set ablaze during the day. They require night to inflict the most terror. Scores of stories tell of either the Ku Klux Klan or other white people traveling into Black neighborhoods under the cover of darkness to abduct Black people from their cabins or houses. The most famous incident remains the murder of Emmett Till. This also means that most lynchings occurred at night as well. With this history in mind, when the patrolmen order the trio to lie on their stomachs in preparation for their executions, the historical reality of lonely Black deaths is mixed with a cabin in the woods motif. Victims in an isolated area with no chance of rescue are left at the mercy of the surrounding horrors. Highly recommend reading this piece. It's real life, and we're about to dive into Lovecraft's history, which again is interesting in context with what we're reading, but I think that bringing the real horrors of being Black in America and commenting on the racism of an influential horror writer like Lovecraft and how those intersect together. I think that's just it's fascinating to me because in the past 10 years, people have started to be like, hey, Lovecraft was pretty racist, right? And there have been which is very clear if you read any of his, I mean, besides the book with the word that shall not be mentioned that's mentioned in the book we're reading. Even just in his most famous stories, it's all pretty clear. It's abundantly clear what his thoughts are about. He's xenophobic and racist. And it's so interesting to me that a white, because on first blush for me, I was like, a white author commenting on racism in Lovecraft and in, you know, Jim Crow.
I have a comment about that. So I want to, because we kind of put the word out to do exactly this. Reiki Master Jojo says, as a Black woman, I'm really enjoying the TV show and I feel motivated to read the book. The author did amazing research, it seems, and writes with respect to truths.
Right.
That's important. Yeah.
And thank you for sharing. And I think too, there's hope, you know, there should be an onus on white women, white men to learn and put yourself in empathy, basic empathy. Listen to Michelle Obama. I don't know. It's important, and to be able to take yourself out of being offended when someone talks about, you know, white women being terrible. Spoiler alert, they are as a group not great. I don't feel offended by that because it's true, and I will try not to do that. But, you know, I think there's a responsibility to learn and teach. And I think that Matt Ruff doing this work, and then Jordan Peele and Misha Green taking it, and J.J. Abrams taking it and elevating it even further, it's sparking these conversations for a reason. And I find it all very, very fascinating. But
going back to the question of like, or the discussion of how the story is presenting sort of mid-50s racism as being just as terrifying as crazy supernatural stuff. The thing that really struck me was like, in the show, in the book, nothing that, because you know sometimes you watch a movie that's made a historical drama and they really play up the racism. They really have like one or two real bigoted characters that are just like, there's no way you could function being that outwardly bigoted, you know, like in like a workplace setting or whatever. And then the hero, whether they're a person of color or not, has to like overcome, and they go, that's wrong. And then the day is saved. That happens so much in these types of stories and movies. But what I love about Lovecraft Country is that none of the stuff on display is like out of the ordinary racism. It's not ramped up racism. It's all very subtle. It's all very like when they're in the woods, man, and that guy pulls him over and he's going, you know, this county, you shouldn't be in this county. I'm like, that was a real thing. And then he goes, okay, we'll drive south and we'll leave. Well, you're not going to make it in 6 minutes. Okay, we'll go north then. That was a real thing. Okay, well then I'll just turn my car around and then we'll leave. And I'll
permission to do the U-turn. Yeah.
Permit that. I was like, even that does not seem like it's a story trying to like really lay the racism on thick. Yeah. That detail specifically, that detail was like, I know that had to have happened. That feels as though it's like, wait, before I do it, can I please do a U-turn here?
Because the whole thing's a trap.
Yes,
They're
yes,
using
yes.
the law. This is why it's like lawful evil. They're using the law to do bad things. And so they're confining that. Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a comment that just came through actually from Black Belt 23. I also think the juxtaposition between H.P. Lovecraft and Matt Ruff, both being white dudes and how they handle racism, which is the point of the book.
Wildly different. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Matt's being like, hey, we're not all Lovecraft. I can do this. I can, can be authentic.
Yeah. So let's dive in a little bit to Lovecraft, and then we'll just talk about everything that happened in the book and the show. Might go a little over for this episode because we've got a lot to talk about. But H.P. Lovecraft, born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1890, spent most of his childhood in New England. When he was 3 years old, his father, I just found this in the Lovecraft sort of like mythos, very interesting. His father had a psychological breakdown, most likely related to syphilis. something that happened a lot at the time. And Lovecraft moved in with his mother's wealthy family. He grew up so terrified that he might also suffer some sort of breakdown, and he also suffered from severe social anxiety and agoraphobia as a teen. Spent a lot of time reading, very into horror and astronomy. In his 20s, he contributed to weird fiction zines, the medium that later became known as pulp fiction, which is referenced in the show, and also there's a movie, or cosmic horror, Lovecraftian horror, etc. Weird Tales was one of the more influential zines, which also published authors like Ray Bradbury. The Martian Chronicles, which is a great book, is a collection of Bradbury stories published to various other zines like this called Planet Stories, the Arkham Sampler. Throughout his life,
it's Artem, Rachel. Just kidding. That's from the book.
Lovecraft was never really able to make any money as an author or editor during his life and died in poverty at the age of, I think it was 46, not 56. That might be a typo that I made. He's regarded as one of the most influential authors of supernatural horror fiction. His writings inspired the Cthulhu mythos, which inspired a ton of media that you know and love, but also he was a massive racist and xenophobe. It's super, super clear in his writing. Over the past couple of years, especially horror and fantasy writers have been trying to reconcile the art with the artists, and Matt Ruff's novel, his goal is to find a way to explore these themes by centering Black characters who are usually the villains of Lovecraft's work. Matt Ruff opens up a new way to analyze that mythos. And he had a lot of interesting themes that tie into the book and what we've read so far in terms of Lovecraft. Stories that kind of focused on his interpretation of humanity's place in the universe. In his view, humanity was an unimportant part of an uncaring cosmos that could be swept away at any moment. Most of his work focused on themes of forbidden knowledge, fate, supernatural influence on humanity, and insanity. And there are some wild Lovecraft gods. We'll get into it later, but some of them pop up so far in the reading or are mentioned. But one thing that it sort of hit home after the show, because I don't think this has happened in the book, but Atticus gets a call from a woman in Korea.
Oh, yeah.
And she's also in I believe it's the same actress, the John Carter opening, which was so cool.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that was
cool.
her.
I was like, what is that?
Yeah. Jackie Robinson.
Yeah, that was amazing. But Cthulhu, which is like Lovecraft's most famous creature, which is a huge creature that looks kind of like a mix between an octopus, a dragon, and like a weird human body. And he's an elder god. We'll get into it. We have time in future episodes to dive into this, but he has the ability to penetrate your mind and drive you insane as he summons you to join him in his lair of darkness. But in the first mention of him, he's described as hibernating in Ryla, an underwater city in the South Pacific.
Ooh.
What with the kaijus?
Ooh, but Rachel, you're saying that there's going to be a connection to the Korean woman.
Because she's saying, like, you couldn't, on the phone, she was like, you shouldn't have come back. And he's got some tie-in with these creatures, like he can I don't know. I feel like there's going to be something there. So I'm just calling it now.
Wow.
Just in case.
Yeah, but I think, when you get a full, complete book like this, and then you adapt it into a show without having to wait. I feel like I'm throwing some shade at Game of Thrones. I guess I kind of am. Without having to wait for like the next book, they can really plan out the whole thing. And I wonder if that character is going to appear in the book later, and they just like put her in the episode in the show earlier to be like, hey, just so you know, he's going to.
Imagine that's the case,
maybe. But also, I was so blown away by like the this season on Lovecraft Country that always happens at the end of HBO. I'm like, what is happening? What's going on? So that's a good call.
Hippolyta too, all of the Hippolyta stuff. So
Hippolyta?
Is it?
Here's the thing I want to bring up. I'm used to calling her Hippolyta because of Wonder Woman. But in the show, George
they said Hippolyta. Okay.
calls her Hippolyta in the show. I want to know, is there audiobook on this? Are you guys doing the audiobook?
I am, but I don't remember now.
Don't remember the pronunciation, Maude? What is it?
Can you say them both again?
Hippolyta, my brain according to Wonder Woman.
Yeah.
The show says Hippolyta. Okay, Lee says he thinks it's like Wonder Woman Hippolyta in the audiobook.
Hippolyta. Hippolyta, yeah.
In
Okay.
the after show last week with Claudia Gray on the Geekbomb YouTube channel, the audio and her pronunciation of
Casterfo is Casterfo.
Casterfo.
She got it wrong.
Later. So let's sort of dive into specific moments.
Okay.
In the book itself, we talked a little bit about Atticus. We meet him as he's coming in to basically help his father, who wrote him this letter that's totally freaked him out. What sort of in the first section, we meet George. We get these great sort of relationships and backstory for Atticus and his contentious relationship with his father, who didn't want him to enlist for a country that hates him, he said, which they disagree, but and he's violent against his son. His son fought back the most recent time he was home, and Montrose, his dad, who's going to be played by Hector. Tell me who it is.
Oh my gosh, I haven't looked it up yet.
Oh my God, you're going to lose your mind, from The Wire.
Yeah. Okay, let's see.
Why am I blanking on his name? He's amazing. Playing Montrose.
Michael K. Williams. Thank you, Lee. Thank you.
Michael K. Williams, and George is.
Michael K. Williams was in Alias as well. Really good.
Oh yeah. And George is played by who is it?
I just closed the tab. Courtney B. Vance. Amazing.
Also amazing, and I love.
He's married to Angela Bassett.
Oh yeah.
I didn't know.
Can you blame him?
He knows how lucky he just talks about how much he just really won the lottery on that one. We also have on Nerdist a really great interview with where did it go? With Jonathan Majors, who plays Atticus, who I think is just perfect casting. I loved when Letitia is like, "That's Tick," the skinny dude in glasses. And it's like
everyone gets a glow up. Well, not everyone gets a glow up, but when you get the glow up, it's a wow.
The show made sure to include a scene where he has his shirt off, where he undid the fire hydrant for the kids in the neighborhood and everybody, and I was like, very smart show, really, really smart.
But he had to have a bath on the side of the road as well, because they can't. I actually saw that there was a twofer, because it's like he got to appreciate the view, but at the same time, he literally has to wipe himself down on the side of the road because they can't enter any premises to be able to do that.
That was a great point. That's a great observation, Maude. Yeah, but Journey Smollett's character, Letitia, was definitely checking him out.
Every outfit she wears.
Amazing.
Oh my God, I know.
It's
amazing.
And I love her, and I love this character in the book. I love that she will not take no for an answer from them. She hides in the back of the car. She keeps saving the day over and over again.
Oh, the moment where it's like he keeps calling George keeps calling her girl, don't do that, girl, girl, and she's just like, my name is Letitia fucking Lewis, and I liked that he respected her for that.
Yeah,
and I was like, can we stop with the pet names and actually learn the name, because we have them. Yeah, I like that.
And we've talked a little bit about the sundown towns and their experiences on the road, and the fact that they have that conversation in the restaurant formerly known as Lydia's. Why is the White House white? Oh,
double meaning.
because of that historical context, he's also able to figure out that they've recently painted it because there's sort of fire. And then you have the firemen who are the ones chasing them. Let's talk about the Adamites, because
Yeah.
So I'm getting major cult vibes, major Watchmen, again, Watchmen HBO, where the whole show that's showing us Jeremy Irons' world and that whole season, you're like, where is he? What's going on? That's what that reminded me of. And also Get Out. Major Get Out vibes.
Yeah.
Yes. And also, Lovecraft's elder gods, all these, world-destroying creatures had cults that wanted to bring them to life.
That's true.
They mentioned L. Ron Hubbard, guys, as an author.
Yeah, somebody said, don't really like him. I was like, nice.
Yeah, I know. They would be like,
great.
On the Hubbard, eh? Yeah.
And one interesting change I saw that I'm interested to see continue are 2 gender swaps for characters in the show versus the book. The George's son is a little boy in the book and is a very cool little girl who draws comics, which I love. And the driver of the silver car, which is Caleb in the book, is a woman.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
So that swap,
listen,
I think that they're making that character a white woman, which I find really interesting. And check out some more interviews with Misha Green. But, the concept of a character who has been oppressed themselves but still oppresses others is very timely to this day. And I think that's just such a smart and interesting change to make, additional commentary.
I had to check myself on that too. I had to check myself when I thought about the first episode of the show and that George's child was a girl and she was drawing comics. I had to check my own misconception about being a comic book fan, because for a second, and I'll be honest, I'm being 100% honest, I was like, oh, it's kind of unrealistic the little girl would be into superhero comics in 1950, whatever. I had to check myself, and then I went, no, of course it's not. That's bullshit. But I'm just so used to what I'm used to. And even though that's what the whole point of the show is supposed to be. So I appreciate these changes. I hope that the show is able to say something about those changes. So maybe even this little girl's perspective, being a girl but drawing super, I would love to just get one line even with her perspective, being a fan of that kind of stuff, that we would not get if the character stayed like a boy character like in the show. So it's adventures in babysitting never happened. I know, Tamaranian.
I think you got that perspective because the hero in her story is a woman, a black woman. So
it didn't
project the image of herself.
Sort of a drawing of her mom too. And in the trailer for this season, you see Hippolyta
comes up later in the book.
So I'm assuming later in the book there's some cool sort of Amazonian stuff there too.
Correct me if I'm wrong too. In the show, they were expecting the comic book from their kid for the road trip. That's what the dad was expecting, which is super cute. She delivers it, and I think he or the mom says, "You changed it," or "You changed."
Yeah, I didn't get that.
So and I need to double check this, but it's like, was she drawing like a white male hero? Because that's another thing about this. If we're talking about fandom, and I'm somebody who experienced this as a kid too, I would draw all my heroes. You can see them all behind me. And I would run out of the peach colored pencil first, because Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman, go over to Marvel, Captain America, Thor, they all are peach before they're different shades of brown. And in my brain, I was like, well, that's what it is. And for many years, I was like, well, that's the only thing that's going to be, that's what a superhero is. Like, that's what it is. So even within the show is the little girl doing comics. And then on this trip, she changes to a black woman, and they're like, so happy. They're like, you changed. I feel like that's what happened. Tell me, chat, let me know.
That was, or that it was inspired by her mom as well.
Awesome.
And I loved
their relationship.
I loved, and that he is sort of learning that he can't, like, his wife wants to go on these trips and experience this with him, and he doesn't want to let her. And then his, watching Letitia save his ass multiple times. He's like, maybe you could do that. Maybe we could go together. And she's so happy. And I think it's interesting to see how people who are marginalized can marginalize others, especially like looking at white women.
But again, like he's protecting her.
Yeah, totally. Because it's very scary.
She's seeing it as limiting. Yeah.
Let's talk about the Adamites and Caleb and Samuel and all of that. What did you think of this section?
Mm-hmm.
But by the way,
with the stained glass pornographic Adam and Eve, I'm fascinated.
First time they've seen a naked body, yeah.
By the way, Lee and Nerdist have confirmed it. The comic she was doing in the show was Panther Man before.
Oh, okay.
So it was a male character, and then she changed it, either inspired by her mom or whatever. This whole section was just. Do you guys remember the scene in Big Fish where Ewan McGregor goes to that town and nobody's wearing shoes?
Yes.
That little town, and everybody has like they steal his shoes, and you have to stay in the grass, and it freaked me out, man. It's very culty. This whole sequence was really creepy, and I'm going to be so looking forward to seeing how they depict it in next week's episode of the TV show.
There's always that, that nightmare that we've all had where you're running from someone or you're like, I know that this is the truth. And they're like, we don't know what you're talking about. You have the truth. And it's
episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender where they're in the Earth.
Ba Sing Se?
Yes.
And they're like, there's no war in Ba Sing Se.
I was like, oh God.
Judy keeps changing a little bit.
Judy's
manufactured. Yeah.
Went to the lake. Yeah.
Everything's perfect. No, you have a black man chained in a basement. Like, that's not cool, man. But I was wondering, I was quite like breaking down when they first check into this house. Yeah, that definitely the Judy vibes with like the housekeeper. Anytime they have a question, I wouldn't go into that room. He took all of his things with him when he left. And then it's like, but we have a nice event tonight. So please, go into the wardrobes. And then the dress fits perfectly. The suit.
Alarm bells.
Yeah, my God. Are you kidding? I'm like, this is the horror aspect.
Yeah.
But in terms of like understanding this sort of religion, I think for me, obviously like Atticus has been kept in the dark a lot. He's got one note to go on and he's kind of going into this blind. And then he spends a little bit of time there, does a little bit of research, goes to the books that he loves to read. And with all of that different parts of information, he's able to tether together the absolute truth and use that truth in such a commanding way where he uses their rules against them. He makes himself in a powerful position when originally he didn't even feel welcome to step on the premises. I loved that scene. And I actually kind of got Dune vibes when they're at the dinner table. And I was like, there is something about banquets or dinner tables where it's a war of the wits that I absolutely adore. Previously though, in Dune, we had both sides kind of like figured out. In this one, it was such an unveiling for me that it was like, I really, really enjoyed that scene.
I also really like how this is a world where H.P. Lovecraft and his writing does exist. So Atticus relies on that. Atticus relies on his knowledge of fiction and science fiction to piece things together and in the book, he's like, honestly, this is kind of what I expected. When he sees these crazy images or the banquet, like you're describing, Maude, and he, puts two and two together. And he's like, I think I'm the descendant, so I can order you guys to do this because I read your bylaws or whatever. And then there's a pause. And then they're all like, mother, and they have to go outside.
Yeah.
I think he was able to go to those. He's able to go. Reading saved him. Exactly, Rachel. He was able to go to those conclusions because reading saved him because he was already a huge nerd. And he was just like, oh, this is nerd world. Like I can just, play with that. The thing about him going ham on those people that were keeping his dad chained up and like killing them and even taking down that dog. I was like, oh, sad dog, but that dog is racist. Let's kill that dog. It was so crazy. It felt like such a 180 where he was like, hang on one second, Dad. And he went upstairs and just started taking him out.
Yeah.
And that to me felt like no matter what people in the chat are saying, I think Miss Necromancer said it. It's interesting that the first part of the book where white characters are being nice to the lead characters, it's red flags for the reader. Like we're like, something's not on the level because we've become by that point so accustomed to the rules of that world
of how they're being treated normally.
How they're being treated. So that when Atticus is breaking his dad out of there, that felt like, okay, even if stuff seems on the level, like Atticus knows, like, I got to get the hell out of here no matter what. Even if he, as a character, is even intrigued by everything that's going around him.
It's changed up too. So it's like, done. Also, I won't say I enjoy the father-son relationship, but I'm intrigued by it because it feels very real.
Yeah.
He saves him and he's like, oh, I'm disappointed in you, son, basically.
Yeah, like, the time you listen to me is the time I don't want you to.
Because he wanted him to stay away, which is...
He cares, but he doesn't know how to show it.
Yeah.
And a lot of parents have that problem from generations and different things, but I find that really interesting, and I am very nervous for Montrose after his invisible bullet wound in the chest. Like, is that gone?
I kind of actually want to touch on that. Nathan made a really great point in the comments, like about some of them getting burnt to a crisp, which happens, I think, after all of this, and said, what's scarier, that the cult exists or that power exists? I'm fascinated by that power. The way that they talk about it, the way that they have like, I think when Caleb pulled out the chair, wasn't it? Like that gesture, or pushed him into the, like whatever it was, he moved furniture, obviously in a telekinesis fashion. And I was like, oh man, because like obviously a cult is, they're all words. They're just words. But now you're inserting actual power and magic into this.
Yeah, I think the actual, and
we've seen it in the show with the car.
Yep.
Yeah.
Not hitting.
And the cult, I think, is scarier because if no one knows about this like old power and isn't trying to raise it, then you're probably fine for a while. If you don't read from the Necronomicon, like
don't go to that island in the South Pacific and we're fine. That's it.
Yeah. But I do find it really interesting that it is so Lovecraftian, but that like reading saves his life again because of the note that Caleb leaves him, and he's looking at this language and can't understand it until everything starts to unlock. But then once he can read the note and then save himself. I just thought that was fascinating. And also, if Caleb can do those kinds of things, and he's only he's not a direct descendant, he's a descendant of the cousin. What's Tick gonna be able to do, and how could that turn into something? Because he definitely has a connection to this, and once you open that door, is it closed? Will it follow you?
And will he have to take his
in the woods?
Will he have to take his shirt off to activate his power? One can only hope that that's what's going to happen in the show every time.
Thirst.
Exactly. You got Journey Smollett.
Yep. Same. I was like, I want to smooch you both.
Jonathan Majors. Yeah.
I love, like, obviously, as I've sort of previously confessed, there are some parts where like my experience watching it differs incredibly from someone else's experiences and like feelings watching it. But I did definitely notice and adore that this is a love letter to literature. Like, I love that. I think that's great. And like this reward system of, he loves reading it and it's saving him. I like that.
And acknowledging that much like the quote that you referenced, Hector, that, it's like people, they have flaws, you still love them, at their varying degrees. But it's a love letter to like sci-fi and horror, but also in learning from what you read and perhaps from the authors. And I don't think I'm pretty sure it's not a coincidence that his knowledge of Lovecraft helps him in this, because he's like, these white people are being really fucking weird, and this sort of cult, and they're referencing things that sound like something important is going to happen. Sound like the racism is part of it because it's Lovecraft. And that I find too. Yeah.
Great comment in the YouTube chat from True Scorn. This is technically horror, Maude. How are you doing reading and watching this?
Yeah, I was going to ask about
because it's sci-fi, sort of like, yeah, it's fine. Like,
just keep telling yourself that it's just sci-fi. It's just
there's
sci-fi.
not many jump scares. Like, I'm just not really good at like those sort of like eerie jump scares. And you know, there's mythical creatures in it. I kind of like how the book did that better than the show.
Yeah, because the show had the cabin that they went to. The show had these creatures somehow are averse to light, so we need flashlights and headlights.
But that's not what it was in the book. What it was is that, did you not notice that all the white people got wiped out, but they didn't come for us? And I kind of liked that mystery, like that taking away from it. But then in the show, they were kind of all a threat, and they had to produce light to kind of get rid of them, which leaves a little bit more wiggle room.
Well, but were they actually, I mean, the question is, were they in danger? Because in the show also, George seems to know more than his son, and he's like, maybe it is something tied to, I don't know, I guess he wouldn't be part of the plan, the Brave Whites. What a great name. Oh, another thing I noticed change in the show is their last name is Freeman, which was the last name given to a lot of former slaves and handed down through families instead of Turner.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I am fascinated by the sort of whatever these creatures are and whatever was happening. And I really actually liked in the book how the ritual is described and how Atticus sort of just understands that while he may not die, he won't be him and nothing will be the world. And that's very like cosmic horror of just like, you can't even understand it because it's not like interdimensional beings or, you know, I mean, Cthulhu and things like that, where it's like everyone goes insane because your brain isn't equipped to handle it. Or what I imagine, like whenever they're like little green men for aliens are depicted as little green men, I'm like, why do we think that that's the case? Why do we think that they wouldn't be like spores or like, you know, something really, I mean,
an arrival hand or whatever that thing was.
Yeah, well, when I was researching Lovecraft, isn't one of his like main tenets or like things is a viscous quality to his creatures, because they're all really like slimy and goopy and have, you know, they have all these eyes and things like that, but it's much less like blood and gore and bone and like this like otherworldly like slithery goop.
Like ectoplasm in any other kind of paranormal sense.
Or slither or go ahead.
That was my main exposure to or familiarity with Lovecraft, is that I have never read any H.P. Lovecraft stuff yet, but all of my friends and people who have would always tell me, oh, the thing about Lovecraft horror is that a character would learn something so profoundly disturbing and out of their power that they would lose their mind or die. Like if they were to see an old god, if they were to see Cthulhu with their own eyes, they'd be dead. And I was like, okay, that sounds pretty gnarly. So I kind of get that, and I like the way it was described in the book, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it, you know, is going to be depicted.
It's interesting knowing Lovecraft's history, besides him being a racist. But like that he grew up worried about going insane because his dad had a psychological breakdown from syphilis, and it's like, oh well, that's all over the world.
It's interesting.
A cruel world that doesn't care about humanity and all of this kind of stuff, where it's like, it seems like we're having a hard time.
Interesting, like an iteration, I guess, in the mythos, especially for Dungeons and Dragons. You've got the Mind Flayer that is very sort of Cthulhu in design and infiltrates your mind as like its psionic powers in a way. And I kind of, you know, It's always about that, to know that that's from seeing a father's debilitating sort of like breakdown from syphilis. Wow.
Yep.
How
Right?
impactful. Yeah.
Listen, once you learn the backstory, it makes it real interesting. One of the co-creators of Superman lost a relative to gun violence when they had a store that was being robbed in like 1930 or something, and the person who was robbing them had a gun, and their relative like had a heart attack and died from that. So then they created a character who was bulletproof.
Yeah.
Like, that's so interesting to me that we can see the seeds of basically trauma is what we're talking about, like depicted in a person's work. So
what would our superhero versions that we would write look like? We'll talk about that in the after show.
Yeah.
Do you guys want to talk about, we'll have plenty more of the show to talk about next week. And we can touch on some of that as it pertains to the book sections. This is my movement. Thank you to everyone in the chat for joining us. And again, we are not like, we're talking about this. If you have a different opinion, if you think that we're wrong, if you want to share a story, please do. We're just trying to talk about this stuff together. And I would love to be corrected or more informed if I'm saying anything, and I know we all feel that way, that upsets you or offends you or anything like that. So thank you for joining us, and you can talk to us directly on the after show coming. What does that say?
Hippolyta.
Oh, I'm gonna do homework.
Okay, great. Okay.
So before, I guess, we talk about where we're going after this, your homework for next week is to read the next 2 sections of the book, Dreams of the Witch House, which is spelled witch, not witch. I don't know. Which I love and reminds me of the Phantom Tollbooth. And Abdullah's book. Stop at the section called Hippolyta Disturbs the Universe. That's where you stop. So read and or listen to the next 2 sections of the book. You can check out previous episodes of Nerdist Book Club on Nerdist and Geek and Sundry's YouTube or Geek and Sundry's Twitch. Please like and subscribe. Please tell your friends to join. If you are watching this on VOD and not live with us, or if we didn't get to your question or comment, tweet us your book recommendations and or your thoughts. We have a Goodreads. Check out our Goodreads discussion points. I'll start one for this book. Or you can join the after show. Maude, how do you do that?
All you have to do is jump onto patreon.com/geekbomb, join the lowest tier, and you get access to the Discord's locked section, which will have a reading component. And then there's a little call area called Book Club. We'll jump on there. It's a Q&A. We get to chat it out. That'll be really fun. But if you don't want that, Discord is still, half of it's still free if you do want to join up and join the community there too.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for joining us. We will see you next week to talk more about Lovecraft Country, book and show. Cheers.
Cheers.
Hector.